It's been almost exactly 30 years since a local company trafficking in hazardous waste closed its gates and seemingly vanished. But it's far from forgotten. The debate over what the property contains and what will happen next is the subject of a new long form investigation in the Oxford American. And I'm joined now by its author, Jordan Blumetti. Good morning, Jordan.
Good morning.
So, thank you for being here. This is a story you've actually followed for years. What prompted you to revisit it in this Oxford American story?
Yeah, initially, I was just driving through Clay County, actually working on another story a couple years ago, and I saw these signs that I referenced early in the piece, and I, I pulled over, started asking questions with some of the residents, and I realized that right away there was a story, an urgent story about the potential development of this property, and then
And what were the signs that caught your eye?
the signs were, large signs of skulls and crossbones, hazardous waste symbols, words like cyanide, arsenic, dioxins, things like that.
Mhm.
And,
Not what you usually see in a semi kind of rural residential area.
no, not at all. And, there's they abut signs for new developments too, which was, a really interesting dichotomy there. I started kind of poking around a little bit as again talking to residents and knew there's a story about the development right away. And then the more I learned about the story, just kind of the stranger it got. The more I learned the history, and started kind of peeling back some of the layers. The stranger it got, and I knew, at that point that there was potential for a longer story. Yeah,
So remind us, I mean, this is a story that people who've lived there for a long time will know this history, and so many people don't know a thing about it.
right.
So remind us, first of all, about the company Solite
hmm
that used to be located there on that property.
Yeah, so the story, it goes back to the late '50s. A company called Solite, run by a gentleman named John Watts Roberts. They basically they created lightweight aggregate concrete by superheating clay and shale, and it really sort of revolutionized the building process in the mid century, and it led to some incredible innovations in construction and skyscrapers and bridges, all kinds of things like that. And about 15 years later, for reasons we can get into, they started burning hazardous waste in the kilns, where the lightweight aggregate was being created, and that the allegations are that the byproduct of those burns led to some adverse health effects.
And so they're basically taking this shale, it's kind of a rock that is sort of like a almost like the clay that's under
Yeah,
the
it's
ground.
exactly,
Yeah,
yeah.
and so they're superheating it, they're
hmm
creating this, product that is
hmm
able to build, as you say, some really well-known structures around
Very
the
well known.
country, things
Yeah.
like the US Capitol and the Guggenheim.
Yes, the renovation to the U.S. Capitol building was used, their material. Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim in New York used the material. Um, you know, Landmarks, Brooklyn Bridge, Yankee Stadium,
Yeah.
all over the country. Landmarks in the nation.
So it's this revolutionary material that's, selling really well.
hmm
It's being produced other places in the country, but at some point they discover that they can burn much cheaper fuels to make it. Tell us what that transition was like and what they started burning.
Yeah. So, the that transition happened again in the mid '60s. This was during an oil embargo, and their fuel source, it basically vanished overnight, and they were facing they were in dire straits, and they didn't know how they would be able to power the kilns. So it coincided with an outgrowth of you know problems with hazardous waste management in the country. This
What
was
to do with it, how
what
to
to
get
do
rid
with
of
it.
it.
Yeah, we were producing a lot of it at the time, and there was really no controls on it. I mean, EPA didn't even exist yet. So, the cement kiln industry kind of came forward with this plan that they could burn hazardous waste as fuel. It's degraded, obviously, but they could burn it as fuel in the kilns, and they could produce their product, and they could also get rid of the hazardous waste, at the same time.
And so some of the stuff that they're burning initially are things like spent jet fuel,
hmm
waste oil, solvents, and things like that. And they're taking them to kind of, as you report, they're blending them with a cleaner fuel and then burning them. But at some point, you've talked to people who say that they were burning that and much worse.
Yeah, they were burning. I mean, it started with those types of, degraded fuels, the spent fuels, but they were taking, um, everything from medical waste from hospitals. They were taking, um, waste from companies like Sony, waste from they would just take arsenic and things like arsenic and cyanide too, and really kind of whatever they could get their hands on to burn.
And some of it, poisonous, and at that time, this, I guess, was considered a beneficial use, right? We're using it to fuel our kilns.
Right,
We're getting rid of this terrible hazardous waste so you don't have to store it anywhere,
right.
um, and so it ends up being just an enormous amount of hazardous waste as you report. Give us a little sense of the amount
Yeah.
that they were trucking in and training into the site.
Yeah, there was, I think annually there's about 2 million pounds of hazardous waste that came just to Clay County. And I should mention too, at a certain point, they kind of, I think the company kind of realized that they can make more money burning hazardous waste than they could with just producing the aggregate. So that's one of the reasons why they just started taking things that really weren't covered by whatever limited regulations did exist at the time. Um, but yeah, they were, I think it's 25 rail cars a day. There was about, I think, 6,000 pounds of ash, dumped into some of the water bodies in the property per day. Um, and it was the hazard the byproduct was running off in the water effluent, from cleaning the the product after it came out of the kiln, and then also smokestacks as well.
And some of the pictures that we're showing, are showing, the site as it was left, and then also some pictures of the area today. And one of those photos is of this, the rail trestle that
Mhm,
leads into the Solite factory, which
mhm.
is sort of iconic for people who might know it. It's like a Leonard Skinner album cover, where they're on this Green Cove Springs,
Right.
trestle.
Yeah, yeah, I kinda discovered that midway through, working on the story, but the Leonard Skinner practice space was very close to Solite, Florida Solite. That trestle is actually it's not the one that goes directly into it's one of the ones that lead into the property, but it's not the one that goes directly over Black Creek. But, yeah, it's right there, I mean, and it's again, I read about this in the piece, but that creek is really, it's central for the residents of Clay County. I mean, that's where everybody spends their time, and it's been traversed for many, many years, by all the residents going back to Native Americans.
So we mentioned that at some point, Solite packs up and leaves.
Mhm,
And there had been some, growing calls, some lawsuits filed in the early 90s, residents saying they're burning hazardous waste.
mhm,
There was a study done by the American Lung Association that found dioxins and furans
mhm,
in the fugitive emissions that were
mhm.
coming off that site. And so there was this growing community pressure about what's going on at this site. Is it a hazard to us? And then they leave.
Yeah, they left, some of the reasons they cite, for doing so were, just the cost of doing business got much higher, but that, is sort of I think, in my opinion, it's a euphemism for, just for increased pressure from not only the citizens, but also state regulators too, because they were in the midst of applying for a new permit that would allow them to burn a lot more hazardous waste, and that's kind of when the screws came down on them.
If you're just joining us, we are talking about a new article in the Oxford American about the Solite plant in Clay County. It's a former hazardous waste site. It remains a community concern. And if you have questions or comments, you can join our conversation. Give us a call at 904 549 2937 or email us at firstcoastconnect at wjct.org. You can also tag us on social media. You talked about the waterways nearby and why that's a concern, but we haven't really gotten into the issue of these ponds that are
Mhm.
on the site. So this property that they own is, 900, 1,000 acres, but the portion of it that was used specifically to manufacture and then to burn this hazardous waste is just a fraction of that.
Yeah.
And on that site, there are a number of these ponds. Tell us what you know about the ponds, what people who've worked there have told you about the ponds, what
Mhm.
they were used for, and how they appeared.
Yeah, early on, I just really I thought it was a lot of heavy breathing about these things. It was all very abstract until I really went there and started to kind of hear these stories for myself. And it turns out that they have been credible. Everything that I was told for the most part has been independently verified in some way. But yeah, so there's many lakes on the property, some man-made, others not. But there's one in particular that all of the, as I was saying earlier, all of the effluent from the actual the kiln itself, it's called a wet scrubber that actually cleans the product after it comes out the other end of the kiln. All that sort of just drained through unlined ditches into a pond, which they called the nightlight, because it glowed at night because of the allegations are because of the pollutants that were in there. And then there's also right next to on the other side of the scrubber pond, the AKA the nightlight. There's a freshwater pond where it's alleged that all of the equipment, basically all of the equipment, was pushed into when they left, very abruptly in '95. And not only that, but equipment for decades that they were just kind of they didn't need anymore. They would just kind of dispose of in there. That's the allegation. And we're talking about dump trucks, cars, catwalks, you know, potentially even like parts of buildings, these types of things. And then there's another lake, a big lake that has kind of man-made peninsulas in it, and a couple of the employees had told me that those peninsulas were built to as burial sites for drums of hazardous waste. And recently a high resolution drone was flown over one of that lake as well, and they actually saw what looked to be like a 55-gallon drum floating in it too.
And there was a time when burying big drums of hazardous waste was just really fairly routine. And
Yeah.
you have pictures with your story that show these disintegrating drums that are somewhat half buried on the property. You can kind of see from the other side of the
Mhm.
fence, even
Mhm.
that show, and the folks that you talked to that worked there, the hazardous waste managers that were familiar with this site that toured the site also told you that that was basically what was done. I mean, this was a place that was around from the 50s,
Yeah.
and there was a time when that was just what you did with it.
Yeah, it's true. I read about this a little bit, but that was considered responsible management for for a while back, early on in the EPA, when drums were just being dumped really into the middle of the Gulf by some of the largest industrial companies in the country. And that berm that you talk about, yeah, you can see that from the property, from the neighborhood of Russell Landing. There's a chain link fence, and then you could see about a 15-foot man-made berm that was, from what I understand, was built as some flood control or a long time ago. But since it's been eroding lately, you can see that there are actual what look to be fragments of 55-gallon metal drums just poking out of them now.
Yeah. So I just want to kind of move into the present
Yeah.
because we're talking about stuff that happened back before 1995. It's much later than that right
Mhm.
now. What is it that residents are currently concerned about when it comes to this property?
Well, the land has never been remediated. There's actually not. We can't even really get any sort of consensus from regulatory bodies about what the extent of the contamination. So first of all, they want what their biggest concern is just trying to get a sense of how much contamination there is and where it exists on the property. Obviously, they did some testing themselves of their own neighborhood, what shares a boundary with Solite, and discovered you know cadmium, lead, barium, chromium, arsenic, several other heavy metals, and at levels above what is permitted by FDP and EPA, and others below. But the biggest thing is really getting a sense of what the scope of this contamination is, and then if it is going to be developed, which is there's a lot of people who would like to see that happen. Their concern at that point would be it needs to be cleaned before that happens. Otherwise, they're just going to be downwind of all this, this toxic dust that would get kicked up because of from the development again.
And you reference a consent order, which is something that is like a legally binding order
Mhm.
that typically a regulator puts on a polluter or a property that says, this is kind of what has to be done to make it right or to clean it up. How long has that consent order been in the works?
So it's about 25 years, a little bit more, I think, at this point. It started with the EPA. So it's a, it bound Northeast or bound Solite, which became Stone Ridge Farms, um, to cleaning up the property whenever it was this kind of decided what exactly needed to be cleaned up. When those studies were done, which still kind of have not been fully done,
So,
but
has it been enforced? I mean,
it has not been enforced. No, because there's still not really consensus about what exactly is contaminated. And then the consent order was transferred to FDEP along the way as well. I think in 2006, and so it's just been kind of um, sitting dormant there since then.
what have you heard from regulators? I know you've reached out to them as well as the property owners. What have any of them told you?
Well, I the only regulator that I really heard back from officially was the EPA, the Atlanta office, and they basically said that we transferred this to FDEP. You're gonna have to talk to them about it. They didn't really have much to say about it. FDEP, unfortunately, I reached out to them many times, but I didn't really hear back. There's like, it was kind of in the midst towards the end of the piece when I was wrapping up. There was some turnover there. They've also, they've been dealing with some legal issues as well. So I just kind of it didn't seem like a priority necessarily, and I never heard back.
When this first closed, it was labeled a Superfund site,
Mhm.
meaning it was on the national priority cleanup list, and it was later taken off that site. I don't know that everybody's necessarily clear why that is, but more recently, there was a push to put houses
Mhm.
on this property. Can you explain where that proposal stands?
Yeah, so, when the residents first caught wind of this, Kristen Burke, who's one of the sources in the piece, who's a commissioner in Clay County now, she ended up running on, this issue among others, but, and she was able to there was a request for rezoning of this property to allow for, higher density building on it, and that's actually been part of Stone Ridge Farms, i.e. Solite's plan since right when the plant closed. They kind of announced this that they were gonna seek, to have this property developed right away, and for whatever reason, it took them a long time to sort of get to the point where they're actually presenting plans and had a developer and had, some handshake deals in place for, for the residential units to be built on this property. But, yeah, Kristen and the commissioners, they ended up putting a moratorium on rezoning in the wake of this proposal from from a developer here in Jacksonville and Northeast Solite. So they said they turned it down, and not only that, but they also they passed a moratorium that wouldn't allow any higher density to be created in the area for the time being until it gets sorted out.
The idea being that they were gonna clean up this property before they built the homes?
Yeah, so basically, if it changed hands, then it would, that then if there was money exchange, then, a certain portion of it is earmarked for the cleanup. That's how the consent order works. So, in theory, that's what would happen. The unfortunately, the dollar figure was calculated a long time ago. It's the general consensus now that it would cost a lot more money to clean up than, originally ventured. So, but yeah, that's how it would in theory, a developer would come in, purchase the land, portions of the cost would go to cleanup, and then he or she can develop the land after that.
We're talking about the legacy of the Solite plant in Clay County, and you can join our conversation at 904-549-2937. We have a call from Tim in Orange Park. Good morning, Tim. Go ahead.
Good good morning. Yeah, I used to work for a concrete block company back a few decades ago, downtown Jacksonville. We made Solite blocks, and I'm just going to tell you that product was unbelievably great. It's a very very good product. And ironically enough, I live about 4 miles away from Russell Road now. But my question is, Um, do they still make that style of block? Because aside from the poisons, I'm going to tell you that was a great product. Thank you very
Hmm.
much, and I'll
Yeah.
listen off the line.
Thanks, Tim. I mean, yeah, so the problem with this plant wasn't what they were making, it was what they were burning.
Yeah, that's a great question, and they do still manufacture the product, along the Hudson Valley in New York at the I'm pretty sure it's the last remaining Solite plant. So yeah, it's a great product. The founder, I read about him in the piece. He's a really interesting guy. I mean, obviously very intelligent and incredibly innovative with this material. It's really impressive what they did, and unfortunately, like everything, there's a shadow side to it. So that's something that they're that we're contending with now. But yeah, it's an incredible product. I mean, look at what it built. You know.
I wanna ask you about the larger community and sort of the business community, because when Solite was operating, it had sort of the full endorsement of the local chamber
Hmm.
and was seen as this wonderful, economic engine for Clay County. Solite would hold Earth Day celebrations
Yeah.
at the plant that the community could come to. What is the sense now of, the community at large? Is it just the people who live right near there that are kind of concerned and raising objections? What is the rest of the community saying?
I would say it's predominantly very dubious of Northeast Solite and Stone Ridge Farms. There's a general consensus, not just in Russell Landing, but also kind of surrounding Green Cove Springs, that this is we're kind of coming to terms with what this company did all these years ago, and they would. The other thing about it too is that I think people are getting a little impatient with the rate of development in the area too, and some of the highway that's being built in connecting Jacksonville and St. Augustine in Clay County. There's a certain way of life is kind of being lost in the midst of that development. So they see it as not only dealing with with the misdeeds of this company and seeing those borne out by some of the reporting here and the sources and the previous employees, but also, just trying to it's connected to the larger development issue right now, which people are really struggling to kind of to swallow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it certainly is a rapidly changing part of Northeast Florida for
Yeah.
sure. Well, it is a, deeply researched article. It is in the New Oxford American by Jordan Blumetti, and we have a link to it on our website. It's a wonderful read. Thanks so much for being here and talking about it.
Thank you so much for having me.
All